The Black Lives Matter movement opposes every single principle of the civil rights movement.
Welcome to Unsafe Media. My name is Ryan Martin, and on this channel, I'm going to help you break down the ideas that shape our time and shape our age and help you respond to them with wisdom and with virtue. Now, you saw in that opening clip a man named Xavier, and he was identifying that Black Lives Matter stands in opposition to many, if not most, of the things that the original civil rights movement actually stood for and fought for. And that's really essential. It's because the Black Lives Matter organization is simply just one of the many praxis wings of the theory, the social theory called critical race theory. Now, in critical race theory, just like with all critical theories, one of the defining features of something that is called a critical theory is that it has to it a social activist component. All right. Very similar if you're familiar with Christian theology. In Christian theology, we have something called orthodoxy, which is like right belief. And then you have orthopraxy, which is right practice, the right way to think about God and the right way to act in reference to God. Now, that's really very, very similar to what you see inside of critical race theory, which is part of the reason why people refer to it sometimes as sort of a religious belief or sort of a worldview belief. Now, there's a lot more to it that actually denotes it as more of a worldview than anything else, but that's at least part of it. Now, today in this specific video, I'm going to help you break down exactly what are at least a few of the major differences or points of conflict between the Black Lives Matter movement, between critical race theory, and the original and unbelievably successful civil rights movement. I find it really important, and as you come back to the channel, you'll see this over and over again. It's really important to let people speak for themselves. We never want to straw man anybody's argument. Of course, I'll do my best. Lord knows I'll make mistakes. So give me some grace, but I'm going to do my absolute best to let the critical race theorists or anybody that I have to mention or represent on my channel, I'm going to do my best to let them speak for themselves. So I'm just going to be reading a lot of quotes from them and then helping maybe make sense of it, explain it a little bit. Probably one of the best places to start is a book, which is really just a collection of articles called Critical Race Theory, the Key Writings That Formed the Movement. It's edited by Kimberly Crenshaw, who is probably up there with Derek Bell as one of the most famous critical race theorists alive, and certainly one of the most influential ones. She was I believe she was the one who actually proposed the name critical race theory, and she was the one who coined the idea of intersectionality. Now, in the foreword here, we have this quote, and this helps you see that they already set themselves up in opposition to the traditional civil rights movement. They say, our opposition to traditional civil rights discourse is neither criticism of the civil rights movement nor an attempt to diminish its significance. Now that rings a little bit hollow because what then follows is several pages of literally doing exactly those two things. One, they accuse the movement of basically being assimilationist, and they use that exact word. And this idea is that they have eschewed and pushed away race consciousness or black nationalism to their detriment, and instead have embraced sort of a false idea of meritocracy, which is really just a myth, they would say, in America. Then they go on to significantly diminish the significance of the original civil rights movement. They do this by saying that while it's nice that store owners can't just say whites only, essentially what has happened is that it worked out that way anyways. It just became more covert. It just became more difficult to actually attack racism, because we could always say, well, we're not saying whites only, right? So it gave racists and the way that racism plays out in a society, it gave it cover to become more covert. Now remember, they are the ones who use the phrase, our opposition to the traditional civil rights discourse, all right? They're the ones setting themselves in opposition to it. And here is the linchpin. Here's where it really divides them from what we consider as the civil rights movement, or at least the legacy of the civil rights movement. Again, from the foreword here, with its explicit embrace of race consciousness, critical race theory aims to re-examine the terms by which race and racism have been negotiated in the American consciousness, and follow this very carefully. Here is the major dividing line. To recover and revitalize the racial tradition of race consciousness among African Americans and other peoples of color, a tradition that was discarded when integration, assimilation, and the ideal of colorblindness became the official norms of racial enlightenment. They then go on to summarize, I think, very nicely what was the sort of legal ideology that came out of the civil rights movement. They say this: mainstream legal argument regarding race relations typically defended its position by appropriating Dr. King's injunction that a person should be judged by the content of his character, right? We hear that constantly, by the content of his character rather than by the color of his skin, and wedding it to the regnant ideologies of equal opportunity and American meritocracy. A few sentences above that, it says, it was not surprising that mainstream legal thought came to embrace the idea of colorblindness as the dominant moral compass of social enlightenment about race. This is the very thing, this colorblindness about race. And of course, nobody means you don't see Asians and you don't see black people, and you don't see Mexicans, you don't see white people, and you don't see Indians, you don't see fill in the blank. Nobody means that. What they mean is again, meritocracy, or that we should be judged by the content of our character or our qualifications or our abilities, not based on some immutable characteristic like skin color. That's the very thing they are attacking. They want to, again, to quote them, to revitalize race consciousness, that they don't back away from the phrase radical. They use it frequently, and we should embrace that as a description of them. When people want to embrace racial consciousness, this is not only deeply, I think, abhorrent and immoral, but it's also a radical, and just in non-moral terms, it's a radical shift from what we have come to see as the enlightened view on race. They do see this radical shift, this departure, as just that, as radical, and they do see it as a Marxist move. And we should as well. We should understand that that's what it is. Now, when I use that word Marxist, for a lot of people, they sort of recoil, their hackles go up. They feel like that's automatically a dismissal or a disproof, and it really isn't. It's just an accurate description. And I don't mean that like, you're dumb. I'm not trying to insult you. That's just an accurate description. Again, it's not meant to be an insult. No academic journal on the topic of critical race theory denies its intrinsic connection to Marxism. It really is just Marxism repackaged. I want to go ahead and show you this. And before I get there, or rather, as I'm going through this material, I'm going to pause in the middle and I'm going to make a case for why we should not view ourselves with race consciousness. Honestly, we shouldn't see ourselves with almost any identity. I'm going to make the case against identity politics more broadly, but hopefully in a nuanced way. And then I'll make the full connection between the critical race theorists and the Marxists, and you'll see how the criticism of one is really the criticism of them all. In her landmark article, Kimberly Crenshaw writes this. It's called Mapping the Margins. This is where she introduces the idea of intersectionality. And she actively advocates for racial consciousness as a means of political power, which just is Marxism. So let me go ahead and break it down. Let me read directly from Mapping the Margins, page 58 of 60. We can all recognize the distinction between the claims I am black and the claim I am a person who happens to be black. I am black takes the socially imposed identity, it means society is putting it on you, and empowers it as an anchor of subjectivity. I am black becomes not simply a statement of resistance, but also a positive discourse of self-identification, intimately linked to celebratory statements like the black nationalist, black is beautiful. You may have a hard time following some of that language, but she's simply saying whenever you simply sort of own it, when you say, this is what I am, you call me black, I'm going to own it, there's something empowering about that. There's something liberating about that, right? To say the Christians did this in the first century. Christian was not, it was an insult. It was imposed upon the Jewish believers, and they were shoving this Greek term on them as a means of sort of denigrating them. And they owned it. They were like, yeah, okay, you can call me that because I'm following him. I'm following the Christ. I'm following the Messiah. So there's something liberating there, she's saying. Then she moves on. She says, I am a person who happens to be black, on the other hand, achieves self-identification by straining for a certain universality. In effect, I am first a person, right? So if you say, I'm a person who's black, then you are disassociating. In fact, she says it a little bit better than I could. She says, I'm a person first, and for a concomitant dismissal of the imposed category black as contingent, circumstantial, and non-determinate. Let me go ahead and go to good old Uncle Aristotle here to sort of use his categories. He says any object has both its sort of substance or its essential qualities and its accidents. So I am 5'8.5", I believe, somewhere around in there. Now, give me an extra inch if I was 5'9.5". That's not going to make me any different of a person. Okay, this is a microphone. It's painted black. We could paint it white. It would still be a microphone. The color of this microphone, my height, these are what Aristotle would call the accidents of a thing. They could have been different. It wouldn't change the substance itself. Okay, and what she's saying here is that when you say, I am a person who happens to be black, you are striving for this universally true thing about humanity. Let me go ahead and pause for a minute and make my case against all levels of class consciousness and race consciousness. As people who love what is good and true, who are pursuing wisdom and virtue, let me put forward the idea that we should ground our self-identity in the substance, but not the accidents of our nature. Okay, not in our height, not in our abilities, not in our race. All right, some of these can't necessarily change genetically speaking, but your intelligence can absolutely change. You get into a car accident, or you get a little bit older and you're not thinking quite as clearly. Don't think of yourself in terms of the negative things that have happened to you. You're not the son of a drunk. You're not a white woman. You're not a black man. You're human, and that's the most essential thing. You're a human. You have a rational soul. You are, and pardon my Christianese, you are made in the image of God. There's something unique. You are the crown of all creation. You are the only thing that actually gives creation its value independent of God. If it weren't for sentience, then everything else is just happy accidents. And not even happy accidents. They're just accidents. There's no happiness involved, right? It's only those who view nature as nature and behold it as such who give it its value. Not only are you those things, rational soul, image of God, but whenever you try to establish your identity on anything other than a universal, then you have, and this is so essential, you have immediately undercut all hope for a rational basis for civil rights at all, or human rights. Anytime we try to find a basis for human rights outside of a transcendent, immaterial, universal truth about all humans, then what you do is you realize is that people are, by definition, going to come out with more and less of whatever your arbitrary definition is. Let's say you define life and value in humans because we're sentient. Well, there's plenty of human beings through birth, through genetics, through accidents, who don't have that same level of sentience. There are plenty of people on the extremely high end of the IQ spectrum who could arguably be said to have significantly higher levels of sentience. From infanthood until genius level IQ 25-year-old fully developed brain, there's a whole spectrum of sentience, right? And so if sentience was the basis for human value, then you would say the 25-year-old man with an incredible intellect would have more inherent value than a toddler. And of course, that is just a reductio ad absurdum. That conclusion disproves it. If sentience leads to that conclusion, then sentience can't be the basis for moral value. It's like that with every other thing other than simply saying humans, by intrinsic value imbued by their creator, anything other than that will lead to and will cut off the foundation for all other civil rights. They will be unequally applied because we're not actually equal in height, strength, intelligence, ability, cleverness, lovingness, compassion, virtue. None of us. Everybody is varying degrees of all of those things. So we have to get to this idea that our self-identity is grounded in universal traits that apply to all humans at all times forever. Now, with that case against class consciousness or race consciousness fresh in your mind, I want to dive back into Kimberly Crenshaw, see how she relates to Marx, and then hopefully disprove both of those or push back on both of those in a meaningful and substantive way. So here she says, there is obviously truth in both characterizations, right? That you can say, I'm a black man, or you can say, I'm a man who is black, okay? But they function quite differently depending on the political context. At this point in history, a strong case can be made that the most critical resistance strategy for the disempowered groups is to occupy and defend a politics of social location. Meaning, okay, all this is fancy Marxist language that can be kind of convoluted, a little bit confusing. Let me see if I can break it down for you, okay? When she says at this point in history, it's because in the Marxist ideology, there is a certain directionality to history. History is moving towards liberation. Now, that was in Marx specifically. The neo-Marxists and the current Marxists don't have quite such a materialistic view about history, but they do at least idealize what history can become, right? They're pushing towards a certain end, towards a certain utopianism. The goal is reorienting society to liberate the oppressed, right? Now, did she use the word oppressed here? Basically, she talks about a critical resistance strategy for disempowered groups, right? That's just the same idea as liberating the oppressed. And she says this is to defend the social location rather than to vacate or destroy it. Again, what does that mean? She means to create a class consciousness until we are able to reorient society into a more just and essentially communistic structure. Let's go backwards from critical race theory in Kimberly Crenshaw. Let's go backwards to Marx. And let's see how he talked about these exact things. So what you'll find is that from Karl Marx through critical theory, now to critical race theory, you can almost just do a search and replace function in the Communist Manifesto and just change out certain words and you'll get the brand new theory. So you take the Communist Manifesto and say, type in the word bourgeoisie and replace it with white supremacy, and type in the word proletariat and replace it with intersectional groups, black women, people of color, that sort of a thing, okay? Now, I'm going to read to you that's my conjecture. Let me prove it. This is coming directly from Section 2, Proletariats and Commies. This is from the Communist Manifesto. The immediate aim, this is Karl Marx and Frederick Engels speaking, the immediate aim of the communist is the same as that of all other proletarian parties. Number one, there's 3 steps here. Number 1, the formation of the proletariat into a class. Again, think of yourself in terms of your class identity. Now, they don't think of themselves, the original Marxists thought of it in terms of economic terms, right? You are a worker, you're labor, you're the proletariat. The intersectional idea is that instead of thinking of yourself as a worker or a laborer, think of yourself as a black woman, right? But either way, it's class consciousness. Think of yourself in terms of your group identity. Number 2, overthrow, and listen to this exact phrase. This is wild. Overthrow the bourgeois supremacy. I can't tell you how many times I've heard about abolishing or obliterating or annihilating or, quote from the Black Lives Matter website, eradicating white supremacy. Now, remember, they're not talking here about obliterating the KKK. They're not talking about getting rid of actual white supremacy groups or neo-Nazis. That's not what they're talking about. There's like 20 of those guys left in the nation. What they're talking about is significantly different, and it's significantly more nefarious. In my next video that I'm going to upload, I'm going to dive into what do the anti-racists mean when they say white supremacy. Again, you think of a guy wearing a sheet that has a little point at the top. You're thinking of a guy who has a swastika tattoo, right? You're thinking of people who really harbor deep-seated animus against people of color. That is not what they mean. And so we're going to dive into that. Let me give you the upshot. The upshot is white supremacy and whiteness are conflated with, basically speaking, Western society. The idea of meritocracy, the idea of objectivity. And I'll come with the receipts and I'll show you in their writings where they're saying that objectivity is a myth, that everything at play is basically just power dynamics, essentially the cisgendered white male patriarchy, Christian patriarchy, yada yada yada, is what we mean by white supremacy. But number 1, Form a proletariat class, which is class consciousness or race consciousness. Number 2, overthrow the bourgeois supremacy, which is just what we now talk about when we talk about overthrowing or eradicating white supremacy, again, which just means Western civilization. And finally, number 3, from the Communist Manifesto, their goal is the conquest of political power by the proletariat. When you start reading any of their materials, they will immediately talk about decentering whiteness, which again just means upending Western civilization, and replacing it with multicultural, multi-ethnic values. Now, they never defined those. And just like every communist revolution, just like every Marxist revolution, there has yet to be a cohesive, coherent idea as to what it means for the proletariat to actually be in charge. All right? The hope is simply that if we have enough class consciousness, if we have an elevated enough sensibility, then it will become clear as we move forward with constant self-reflection, self-criticism. Now, back to the original thesis. When he says he's not for why Xavier says he's not for Black Lives Matter, because they're not for the things that the civil rights were for, it's because the civil rights era was against class consciousness. Well, it's because they were against race consciousness as such. They were for actual meritocracy, regardless of skin color. And whenever we see that isn't taking place, instead of saying, okay, well, let's give it up, let's just go back to race consciousness, in the spirit of the civil rights movement, in the spirit of Frederick Douglass, we should say the country is not living up to its creeds, call it to do just that, and stand by it. Stand by it firmly. And I think that is a significantly more moral, significantly more historical, and rational way to go about it. Again, this is Unsafe Media. If you like this content, if you want to see more of it, there's a lot of ways to support us. My link tree is down below. I've got a Patreon for ongoing support and a Venmo for one-time support. Otherwise, like, share, subscribe, do all the random crap that everybody tells you to do. Have a blessed night.